Adlachar Ovalia. Maar wann die Zeit noch nicht gesehen? Der Bracham Adlachar. Das ist leider nicht geschehen. בכל העניינים. מה שיצאנו לאחרונה, יצאנו מפסו כמה עניינים. מה שלא יאות, וגם משהו שעדיין משאיר ליבו. אז הייתה משהו למה ידיעתו. הכנראה שהיא מספיק, כאילו שהיום כבר כמה שעות בגיל עדיין ליבו. אבל יש עוד כמה שעות, אבל יש להשתדל גם היום, בצורה טובה. יש שמחה וטוב לראות. כדי שחסידים מקפידים שכל מנהיגים את שמחה. בצורה טובה, הצלחה רבה.
Isolated pockets of fire, 2 water lines to knock them down. FEMA's executive summary relays that much of the fuel in the planes, jet-grade kerosene, was consumed by the initial fireballs and the following few minutes of fire.
The Twin Towers were composed of 200,000 tons of steel and 425,000 cubic yards of concrete. The core of each tower was a rectangular pillar 87 by 133 feet, comprised of 47 steel box columns ranging from 36 by 16 to 52 by 22 inches.
Inside there was the core, a rectangle of 47 columns made of 4-inch thick steel at the base. The cores combined might with ingenuity.
In October of 2001, Scientific American told us that they just don't build them as tough as the World Trade Center.
The story we were told. This rock-like steel grid gave way because fire warped the trusses, causing the bolts to fail. As the trusses sagged and fell, the floors dropped with them. In its 2002 documentary, Why the Towers Fell, PBS creates a video model.
Once the trusses fail, the floors they were holding cascade down with a force too great to be withstood. The result is what's called a progressive collapse, as each floor pancakes down onto the one below.
What remains standing? The tall, indestructible core. Why does PBS fail to explain the complete disappearance of the Twin Towers' cores?
Firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents. Towers! A huge explosion now. All of us.
Floor by floor instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated. If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
Chief Albert Turry told me that there was another explosion which took place. So according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
The U.S. and how operatives were directed to carry them out. That is valuable information for those of us who have the responsibility to protect the American people. He told us the operatives have been instructed to ensure that the explosives went off at a point that was high enough to prevent people trapped above from escaping. The explosives went off at a point that was high enough to prevent people trapped above from escaping.
Oh my God! That was a bomb that did that.
Oh, fuck! Look at that!
That was a fucking bomb that did that. There's no goddamn way that could have happened.
The entire top of the building just blew up.
A second explosion and another explosion. We have a report now of a fourth explosion at the Trade Center. There has just been a huge explosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. Not clear now is why this explosion took place.
When I was coming through the doors on the other side of the Trade Center, something, either they blew the lobby up or something, because it blew the glass out of the doors and knocked us all down.
This is actually, we believe, debris from one of the planes that hit one of the towers on the World Trade Center. The FBI is here, as you can see. They had roped this area off. They were taking photographs and securing this area just prior to that huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
Who was behind the terror attacks?
Larry Silverstein became landlord on July 24th, less than 2 months before the attack. He then had control of the maintenance and security departments, and he began to replace security personnel. Silverstein brought Frank Lowy into the deal to become landlord of the underground shopping mall. Lowy is a billionaire who owns shopping malls in several nations. After the towers disintegrated, Silverstein demanded insurance companies pay him twice what the policy stated, on the grounds that each tower underwent separate attacks.
CBS's Jim Stewart in Washington has been tracking events all day and has the latest. Jim?
We're told rescue workers have recovered a passport in the debris. It belonged to one of the dead hijackers.
Another development on Saturday, New York officials revealed at a news conference here in the city that a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
Not far from here, a passerby found the passport of one of the hijackers. Evidence this disaster scene is also a crime scene.
These passports are so magical and so wonderful that, like Gollum's ring, they call to you. They call to who they want to find them, but not any normal mortal. No. The ring calls out only to FBI agents. So the magical Thor's hammer material passports go out of the building, down to the ground, and then once they're on the ground in feet of dust and millions of papers everywhere, the FBI that day finds not one but two of the shards of Thor's hammer, and again, it calls out to them psychically, and they go to it and they have it.
The 9/11 Commission says the CVRs and FDRs from American 11 and United 175 were not found. Yet, the FBI claims to have found the passport of Saddam al-Sakami, which managed to fly out of his pocket, through the explosion, and onto the streets of Manhattan below. So, 4 different black boxes, made from the most resilient materials known to man, were destroyed. Yet, a passport, made from a fragile material known as paper, managed to survive? Who writes this stuff?
You know, it might have appeared that way, but from my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. The only site is the actual site of the building that's crashed in, and as I said, the only pieces left that you can see are small enough that you could pick up in your hand. There are no large tail sections, wing sections, a fuselage, nothing like that anywhere around, which would indicate that the entire plane crashed into the side of the Pentagon.
Flight 77 looks small in this computer simulation because the Pentagon is the largest office building in the world. More than 20,000 people work there. The high concentration of people means that crashing an airplane into the Pentagon could kill thousands of people. Yet the terrorists hit the only portion of the building that was almost completely empty because it was being renovated.
The section hit was the headquarters of Naval Operations, Naval Intelligence, and the Navy Command Center. Army personnel were also killed. A number of accountants and budget analysts were also present at the time and killed in the attack. The Arlington County After Action Report states that important budget information was in the damaged area. It's interesting that 24 hours prior, Donald Rumsfeld publicly made this announcement.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
Back on October 24th, 2000, the Pentagon conducted MASCAL, a mass casualty exercise which simulated the impact of a Boeing 757 into the building.
I don't think anybody could have predicted that these people would take an airplane and slam it into the World Trade Center, take another one and slam it into the Pentagon.
Nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government that could envision flying airplanes into buildings.
But that turns out not to be true. U.S. military planners did envision and practice those very scenarios. As reported by USA Today, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, conducted exercises with fighter jets, simulating hijacked planes flown into the World Trade Center in the 2 years before the attacks. Pentagon planners also envisioned the attack on the Pentagon 5 months before it happened.
If the terrorists crashed into any other area of the Pentagon, thousands more may have died. Furthermore, one of the purposes of the renovation was to increase the strength of the windows and walls to make them better able to withstand an attack. To summarize, the pilot did a spectacular 270-degree turn to hit the strongest part of the Pentagon with the fewest number of people in it.
Well, the simple fact is, Barry, that they didn't know where to go. The reason that they didn't know where to go was because a number of conflicting and overlapping war game exercises were taking place, one of which Northern Vigilance had pulled a significant number of North American fighter aircraft into Canada and Western Alaska and Northern Alaska in a mock Cold War hijack exercise. There was another drill, Vigilant Guardian, which was a hijack exercise, a command post exercise, but it involved the insertion of false radar blips onto radar screens in the Northeast Air Defense Sector. There was another exercise, Vigilant Warrior, which was in fact, according to a NORAD source, a live fly hijack drill being conducted at the same time. With only 8 available fighter aircraft, and they have to be dispatched in pairs, they were dealing with as many as 22 possible hijacks on the day of 9/11, and they couldn't separate the war game exercises from the actual hijacks.
NORAD mission commander ordered his only 3 other planes on alert in Virginia to scramble and fly north to Baltimore. Minutes later, when he was told that a plane was approaching Washington, he learned that the planes were flying east over the Atlantic Ocean, away from Baltimore and Washington. So that when the 3rd plane struck the Pentagon, NORAD's fighters were 150 miles away, farther than they were before they took off. And we can set up all of the oversight possible at great additional cost to the American taxpayers, and it won't be worth an Enron pension if the people responsible lie to us. If they take the records and doctor them into falsehoods, and if they get away with it.
We do not have a clear explanation for why fighters from Andrews Air Force Base were sent out over the sea first and couldn't turn around because the 9/11 Commission seemed to change all the evidence just arbitrarily right before it issued its final report. So we don't have a clear explanation, but certainly it's all consistent with a motive that said make sure that the fighters don't get to any place in time to stop the 3 critical attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon.
Do we want to think about scrambling aircraft? Oh, God, I don't know. That's a decision somebody's going to have to make probably in the next 10 minutes.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 men armed with box cutters, directed by a man on dialysis in a cave fortress halfway around the world using a satellite phone and a laptop, directed the most sophisticated penetration of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, overpowering the passengers and the military combat-trained pilots on 4 commercial aircraft before flying those planes wildly off course for over an hour without being molested by a single fighter interceptor. These 19 hijackers, devout religious fundamentalists who like to drink alcohol, snort cocaine, and live with pink-haired strippers, managed to knock down 3 buildings with 2 planes in New York. While in Washington, a pilot who couldn't handle a single-engine Cessna was able to fly a 757 in an 8,000-foot descending 270-degree corkscrew turn to come exactly level with the ground, hitting the Pentagon in the budget analyst office where DoD staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had announced missing from the Pentagon's coffers in a press conference the day before, on September 10th, 2001. Luckily, the news anchors knew who did it within minutes.
Osama bin Laden.
The pundits knew within hours.
Osama bin Laden.
The administration knew within the day.
Terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
And the evidence literally fell into the FBI's lap.
That a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site, if you can believe that.
But for some reason, a bunch of crazy conspiracy theorists demanded an investigation into the greatest attack on American soil in history. That investigation was delayed, underfunded, set up to fail, a conflict of interest, and a cover-up from start to finish. It was based on testimony extracted through torture, the records of which were destroyed. It failed to mention the existence of WTC-7, Able Danger, P-TECH, Sibel Edmonds, OBL and the CIA, and the drills of hijacked aircraft being flown into buildings that were being simulated at the precise same time that those events were actually happening. It was lied to by the Pentagon, the CIA, the Bush administration, and as for Bush and Cheney, well, no one knows what they told it because they testified in secret, off the record, not under oath, and behind closed doors.
Nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government that could envision flying airplanes into buildings.
Except the Pentagon, FEMA, NORAD, and the NRO. The DIA destroyed 2.5 terabytes of data on Able Danger, but that's okay because it probably wasn't important. NIST has classified the data that they used for their model of WTC-7's collapse, but that's okay because knowing how they made their model of the collapse would jeopardize public safety. Osama bin Laden lived in a cave fortress in the hills of Afghanistan, but somehow got away. Then he was hiding out in Tora Bora, but somehow got away. Then he lived in Abbottabad for years, taunting the most comprehensive intelligence dragnet employing the most sophisticated technology in the history of the world for a decade, releasing video after video with complete impunity and getting younger and younger as he did so, before finally being found in a daring SEAL team raid which wasn't recorded on video, in which he didn't resist or use his wife as a human shield, and in which these crack special forces operatives panicked and killed this unarmed man, supposedly the best source of intelligence about those dastardly terrorists on the entire planet. Then they dumped his body in the ocean before telling anyone about it. Then a couple dozen of that team's members died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. If you have any questions about this story, you are a paranoid, tinfoil, dog-abusing baby hater and will be reviled by everyone. If you love your country, you will never ever express doubts about any part of this story to anyone. Ever. This has been a public service announcement by the Friends of the FBI, CIA, NSA, DIA, SEC, MSM, White House, NIST, and the 9/11 Commission. Because ignorance is strength.
This is a bomb. This is a fuse. A red line should be drawn right here. Before Iran completes the second stage of nuclear enrichment necessary to make a bomb.
That Israelis who worked at the World Trade Center were warned by the Israeli government to take the day off on 9/11.
And also the alleged art student spying, which was rounded up in 2002. And they, again, were supposedly Israeli Mossad agents. Now, both of these spirings weren't prosecuted. And in fact, the stories have been quietly removed from things like Fox News websites and things. And the spies, or alleged spies, were just quietly deported back to Israel.
My binoculars, and I could see the towers from my window. And this is where I'm looking. And all of a sudden, down there, I see this van parked, and I see 3 guys on top of the van, and I could see that they were like happy. You know, they didn't look shocked to me. You know, they didn't look shocked.
The FBI has now put out a nationwide APB, all points bulletin, for a white Chevy van with New Jersey registration. Written on the back is Urban Moving Systems. Apparently there are 3 male occupants. Let's repeat that. The FBI has now put out an APB, an all points bulletin, nationwide. They're looking for a white Chevy van with New Jersey registration, and written on the back of the white van are the words Urban Moving System. Apparently this van is carrying 3 male occupants. Obviously, if you see this van, you're asked to contact the FBI immediately.
6 hours after the attack, the van was stopped at a roadblock by patrolman Scott DiCarlo.
We were asked to detain the van and the passengers. They were just removed from the vehicle, patted down for safety precaution, and detained.
911 call at 410 Park.
I think once the FBI arrived, one of them stated that they were on our side. There's something to that effect. The mood was confusion. As people were driving by, they were screaming all sorts of excerpts. Profanity, things to that effect. Nothing that I'd care to repeat.
3-1 day, they're in service.
Over 2 months of interrogation began. The FBI discovered the men weren't from Al-Qaeda. They were Israelis. A passerby took these photos of the police searching the van. 5 men were inside it. Some had dual nationalities and were carrying more than one passport. Others had flight tickets to leave the US within days. Fearing robbery, one had over $4,000 hidden in a sock. They told interrogators they were working for Urban Moving, a shipping and storage firm run by an Israeli businessman who often employed Israeli students without work permits. The men say there was an innocent explanation for what was found in the van and their behavior on 9/11. They were, they say, simply on a working holiday. Their boss at Urban Moving, Dominic Suter, was questioned by the FBI, but then disappeared back to Israel. It left lots of unanswered questions and fueled suspicion about the 5 men. Tuval Aviv is a counter-terrorism advisor to the US Congress, but was once a spy for Israel's Secret Service Mossad. He says Urban Moving was a front company for Israeli intelligence, and that some of its workers were spying illegally in the US.
Israel has engaged in intelligence gathering in friendly countries. Some of it is done with permission, and some of it probably has been done without permission in areas that is vital to Israeli interest.
Inspector Marino. Inspector Marino, go ahead. Thank you. Five the message about the plane. Sergeant Middle, 7-5. About the plane. 10-5 the message about the plane. 9414, hold up. 5 the message about the remote control plane. Station 4 is on the air. So clear the air for the message about the plane. At this time, all citywide task force units are to respond to Trinity and Liberty. All citywide task force units are to respond to Liberty and Trinity Place. 10-5, the message of the plane. Be advised, I'm through. I'm not film, Central. This is for all citywide task force units. Trinity Place and Liberty will be your mobilization point at this time. Trinity Place and Liberty. For CO, Central. Who is the authority of? 10-5, the message about the plane. Central, we need the bomb squad and ESU over King and... Sergeant, last message. All units. Hello, Jameson on here. 915, you on? 85 by the 10 stations operators. Bobby. Negative. Give an update on the plane. Central, I got a message on that plane. It's a big truck with a mural painted of an airplane diving into New York City and exploding. I don't know what's in the truck. The truck is in between 6th and 7th on King Street. All right, 10-4, I'll send the issue in the bomb squad there for West Gate. The phone? Before the rest message? That's fine. With a mural painted, airplane diving into New York, blowing up. 2 men got out of the truck, ran away from it. We got those 2 under. That's good. You got those? Are you holding those 2 guys, Kate? We got them under. Let's get the music going here. Listen to that. Fucking beat the shit out of them. All right, get in. All right, listen, you need any further on those 2 guys over there? You all right over there, Kate?
Yeah, both suspects under K. We have the suspect who drove in the van exploded. We have both of them under K. Let's get some help over here.
Now, I'm sending you ESU there. I just want to make sure you and your guys are all right over there, Kay. That's all. What's the location of that, Kay?
And word late tonight that 2 suspects are in FBI custody after a truckload of explosives was discovered around the George Washington Bridge. That bridge links New York to New Jersey over the Hudson River. Whether the discovery of those explosives has anything to do with other events today is unclear, but the FBI has 2 suspects in hand, said the truck load of explosives, enough explosives were in the truck to do great damage to the George Washington Bridge. But they arrested the 2 suspects and they're questioning them as we speak.
Our apologies to our viewers about 5 minutes ago, but we do have an established connection now with CNN's Deborah Fayrick. The reports we're getting now, 2 or 3 men arrested on the New Jersey Parkway. Deborah, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. That is the information that I am getting from 2 sources, that there was a van either on the New Jersey Turnpike or the Garden State Parkway, and that it was near the George Washington Bridge. There were 2 or 3 men who were in the van. The van was pulled over. It is not clear why the van was pulled over, but when it was, law enforcers found tons of explosives inside of the van. That is right now all I'm hearing, but again, 2 to 3 people in custody, and we are trying to get more information on that right now.
Deborah, I don't mean to put you on the spot here. Do you know where on the Jersey Turnpike this was? How far from New York City?
We do not know that. We are looking into that. There is one report that it was on the New Jersey Turnpike. There is another report that it was very close to the bridge, if not on the bridge. So again, these details are all emerging, and we're trying to piece them together. But that's what we've got so far. 2 to 3 people in custody right now, found with a van filled with explosives.
Earlier, we had heard that an FBI spokesperson said that there was a report on the George Washington Bridge, which is another facility which you folks are responsible for policing, a report that there had been a van stopped there that had explosives.
Asked this week about another sprawling investigation and the detention of 60 Israelis since September 11th, the Bush administration treated the questions like hot potatoes.
Just refer you to the Department of Justice with it. I'm not familiar with the report.
I'm aware that some Israeli citizens have been detained. With respect to why they are being detained and the other aspects of your question, whether it's because they are in intelligence services or what they were doing, I will defer to the Department of Justice and the FBI to answer that.
On March 6, 2002, a draft report from the DEA said it may well be an organized intelligence gathering activity. Despite all of this, all the Israelis were let go, without any espionage charges being filed. Fox News anchors Britt Hume and Carl Cameron would do a 4-part investigation into these allegations in December of 2001 and yield stunning results. It has been more than 16 years since a civilian working for the Navy was charged with passing secrets to Israel. Jonathan Pollard pled guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage and is serving a life sentence. At first, Israeli leaders claimed Pollard was part of a rogue operation, but later took responsibility for his work. Now, Fox News has learned some U.S. investigators believe that there are Israelis again very much engaged in spying in and on the U.S.
Since September 11th, more than 60 Israelis have been arrested or detained, either under the new Patriot anti-terrorism law or for immigration violations. A handful of active Israeli military were among those detained, according to investigators, who say some of the detainees also failed polygraph questions when asked about alleged surveillance activities against and in the United States. Investigators suspect that the Israelis may have gathered intelligence about the attacks in advance and not shared it. A highly placed investigator said there are, quote, tie-ins, but when asked for details, he flatly refused to describe them, saying, quote, evidence linking these Israelis to 911 is classified. I cannot tell you about evidence that has been gathered. It's classified information.
Now, when the FBI investigated, it quickly unraveled to be the largest foreign spy ring ever uncovered inside the United States, the largest. Even the Soviet Union had not been spying on the United States as much as Israel has been doing. So the FBI started to round up these spies. They started to arrest them very quietly, and they were about halfway through this process of rounding up this spy ring when 9/11 happened.
Numerous classified documents obtained by Fox News indicate that even prior to September 11th, as many as 140 other Israelis had been detained or arrested in a secretive and sprawling investigation into suspected espionage by Israelis in the United States. Investigators from numerous government agencies are part of a working group that's been compiling evidence since the mid-90s. These documents detail hundreds of incidents in cities and towns across the country that investigators say, quote, may well be an organized intelligence gathering activity. The first part of the investigation focuses on Israelis who say they are art students from the University of Jerusalem and Bezalel Academy. Documents say they, quote, targeted and penetrated military bases, the DEA, FBI, and dozens of other government facilities, and even secret offices and unlisted private homes of law enforcement and intelligence personnel. The majority of those questioned, quote, stated they served in military intelligence, electronic surveillance intercept, and/or explosive ordnance units. A General Accounting Office investigation referred to Israel as Country A and said, quote, according to a U.S. intelligence agency, the government of Country A conducts the most aggressive espionage operation against the U.S. of any U.S. ally. The document concludes, quote, Israel possesses the resources and technical capability to achieve its collection objectives.
What about this question of advanced knowledge of what was going to happen on 9/11? How clear are investigators that some Israeli agents may have known something?
Well, it's very explosive information, obviously, and there's a great deal of evidence that they say they have collected. None of it necessarily conclusive. It's more when they put it all together. A bigger question, they say, is how could they not have known? Almost a direct quote, Britt.
It is now apparent that this intelligence ring was inside the U.S., had prior knowledge of 9/11, and had a classified role in 9/11, which officials refused to discuss. It was also able to penetrate U.S. intelligence agencies and secret offices, yet all were released. The men who were detained due to the report they were taping the first plane crash and then celebrating and joking about it actually went on television and admitted it was their job to record the attack.
And at that point, we were taken for another round of questioning, this time related to our allegedly being members of Mossad. The fact of the matter is, we are coming from a country that experiences terror daily. Our purpose was to document the event.
I'm Leanne McAdoo with Infowars.com, reporting here from Times Square. I am standing next to Rudy Dent. He's a 32-year veteran of the New York City Fire Department. He's worked as well with the New York City Police Department. And you retired right after 9/11. He was there on 9/11. He saw World Trade Center Tower 7 come down. Rudy, tell us about what happened that day.
Well, I was off that day, and I received a call at home, and I got to see both buildings come down on TV. I jumped on my motorcycle. I did about 120 miles an hour across the Tappan Zee. I reported to my firehouse, and then I got my gear. A bunch of us got together. We commandeered a mail truck, and we made our way down to the site. At that time, Building 7 was still up. I saw Building 7 come down. My fellow firefighters who were there, they did that involuntary jerk when a loud explosion goes off. You know, you can't help it, and they did. I'm a Vietnam veteran too, so I kind of didn't jump like they did, but there was an explosion. The building did come down in complete classical controlled demolition. It came down on its own footprint. There's no question about that. As a matter of fact, Richard Gage from Architects and Engineers has completely handled that from his area of expertise. Okay.
Now, we heard rumblings, things that the fire department was saying that they were overhearing Larry Silverstein talking to his insurance company of whether or not he should have the building pulled.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
In your professional opinion, was the building pulled?
Well, let me say this. In the New York City Fire Department, As I said, I had 32 years there. I was a chauffeur, and I was also a trained fire marshal. A fire marshal is considered an expert witness in court. He's like a forensic detective. He has the power to administer the oath, take testimony, and issue a subpoena. That's a lot of power. And he's a highly trained investigative person in his area of expertise in arson. And we have no term that I know of that says pulling buildings. That's not our area of expertise. We've never done that. We don't do that. So for him to say that, I don't know where he pulled that out of, but it's just not part of our operations, okay?
Right, so the fire department doesn't have the training to pull a building, to demo a building like that.
We're not trained to do that. We've never done that in my 32 years. I know of no evolution whatsoever that does that.
And then talk to me a little bit, obviously, as a professional in the fire department for 30 plus years, they're saying that blaming it on office fires, just a few office fires.
Well, if it wasn't so serious a situation, that would be completely laughable. That is ridiculous. First of all, our guys were up there. They were calling for additional hand lines to mop up the isolated pockets of fire. And let me just explain one thing. Never in the history of the world, never in the history of high-rise skyscrapers has ever a skyscraper ever come down because of fire. And I'm talking massive fire. And you know the reason why? Because fire does not burn by itself hot enough to compromise and melt steel. What we had in the World Trade Center, and I saw myself, was molten lava-like pockets of molten steel. All right, I spent the night on the pile searching for bodies, and I saw that with my own eyes. So who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe a bunch of government bureaucrats or my fellow brothers, which I lost 343 guys that day? And I lost Tommy O'Hagan, Bruce Van Hines, and Kenny Kumpel. And I can never forget that. I think of that before I go to bed. I think about it the first thing in the morning when I wake up. And it's in honor of them and their family that I will continue to do everything I can to make the rest of the world wake up to the fact that this was a false flag operation.
Right. What did you think about them taking all of the debris away so quickly?
That was a crime in and of itself, because the classical thing that any investigator is taught is protect the crime scene. And NIST and the 9/11 Commission lied to the public. I mean, you cannot be that stupid. You cannot be that stupid. In law, as a former police officer, every crime or offense has a degree of mental culpability. Either you knowingly, intentionally, recklessly, or negligently committed the act. And the mere fact that there were obviously the definition of a conspiracy is when two or more people acting in concert knowingly commit an offense or a crime, all right? A misdemeanor or a felony, an offense. That is the definition of a conspiracy. Was this a conspiracy? Absolutely. Yes, it was. And those people need to go to jail for treason.
After 9/11, Mr. Silverstein fought his insurers in court to obtain double his policy limits for the destruction of his property, maintaining that the double hijacking constituted two disasters caused by terrorists, not just one. He won and was awarded over $7 billion, a magnificent return on his original $15 million investment.
My first reaction is to think about the families of those people, the tragedy, the magnitude of it. However, I firmly believe that we should rebuild.
Where were you on September 11th?
You know, I was home. And the only reason I wasn't where I was every morning, subsequent to the 26th day of July, my mornings were spent usually at a breakfast meeting at Windows, an 8 o'clock breakfast meeting, Windows, the top of it, and then going down to visit with my tenants, my new tenants, at the trade center, getting to know them, understanding their problems and so forth, ascertaining how we could service their needs better, which is one of the first things you do when you acquire a property. You begin to meet your tenants and start talking with them. And so my mornings were spent at the trade center, and then by noon I was back uptown. And so that particular morning, because I have light-colored hair and fair skin, and I'm an annuity to the dermatologist, my wife, God bless her, had made an appointment for me at the doctor. And I remember dressing to go to the doctor. I'm finally saying to my wife, I said, sweetheart, I've got so much to do downtown. I got to cancel this. I've got to go downtown. And she said, you're not going to cancel this appointment. You're going to the dermatologist. And, having been married now to the same woman for 46 years, you get this sense of determination on occasion, their voices. And I said, okay, yes, dear, I'll go. And then just minutes later, received a telephone call to turn on a television set and witnessed this horrendous circumstance. The first plane hitting, and then the second plane hitting. Of course, with the second hit, it became obvious that this was terrorism. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Stretch. Big stretch. Oh, sorry.
Mr. President. I know you said there'll be a time for politics, but you've also said you wanted to change the tone of Washington. Howard Dean recently seemed to muse aloud whether you had advanced knowledge of 9/11. Do you agree or disagree with the RNC that this kind of rhetoric borders on political hate speech?
Yeah. Look, there's time for politics. And, it's time for politics. And, it's an absurd insinuation.
In that case, sir, can I follow up on something unrelated?
Now, this video clip that we've just examined came again from the Naudet brothers documentary that was being filmed in the streets of New York City on the morning of September 11th. This documentary about the New York City firefighters was going to be assembled at a later date, and it was not televised. In fact, there was no live coverage at all of Flight 11 as it hit the North Tower. After all, it was a surprise attack. So if there was no live television coverage of the first plane hitting the first tower, how do we explain the following comment from George Walker Bush?
What was the first thing that went through your head when you heard that a plane crashed into the first?
Well, I was sitting in a schoolhouse in Florida. I'd gone down to tell my little brother what to do, and you can go ahead and sit down. Just kidding, Jeb. And it's the mother in me. Anyway, I was sitting there, and my chief of staff, well, first of all, when we walked in the classroom, I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on, and I thought it was pilot error.
Completely shocked. Unbelievable.
Right, that's the view from the Palestinian side. Joining me now here in the BBC World studio is the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who's in London at the moment. Mr. Barak, welcome to BBC World. First, your reaction, having heard what's happened. At least 4 planes have been hijacked, and there may be more.
The world will not be the same from today on. I don't know who is responsible. I believe we will know in 12 hours. Bin Laden sits in Afghanistan. There is a source of
who else
terror.
Can you identify, though? Because we're not saying he's responsible for this necessarily.
No, we don't say that he's responsible. Every simple step, crossing borders or going on a plane or on a ship, will become more complicated. It's a time to launch a operational, concrete war against terror, even if it takes certain pains from the routine activities of our normal society. This is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror. Consistently, along 6 or 10 years, Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea, this is the only way. Without this clarity of purpose, there will be no world order, no world order possible.
In the months leading up to the event, American negotiators had warned Afghanistan's Taliban that they were interested in securing right-of-way for proposed pipeline projects, and the U.S. would achieve this with either a carpet of gold or a carpet of bombs. The Bush administration's first major national security directive, a full-scale battle plan for the invasion of Afghanistan, including command and control, air and ground forces, and logistics, was drafted and sitting on the president's desk to be signed off on September 4th, 2001, 7 days before the 9/11 attacks. The invasion proceeded as planned in October.
If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region. The reverberations of what happens with the collapse of Saddam's regime could very well create an implosion in a neighbor regime like Iran.
Has reported Israel's former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has publicly said the September 11th attacks have been good for Israel. Netanyahu said, quote, "We're benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq," end quote.
It was one of the most audacious acts of terror the world had ever seen. They used 350 kilos of gelignite and TNT, and they planted the bomb in broad daylight in a building full of people. The bomb killed 91 people and 45 others were injured. But little did the bombers of Jerusalem's King David Hotel back in 1946 know that they were one day to be hailed as the founding fathers of a new age of terror. For their success inspired waves of imitators around the world.
We didn't mind being called terrorists then, because we actually used force, such force, a brutal force, in order to get rid of them.
This is the story of the birth of modern terrorism, of the activists who invented it, and of how it has been appropriated and dispersed around the globe.
After a bomb explosion caused by terrorists on the British headquarters at Jerusalem, one entire corner of the King David Hotel, a building of 7 stories, was razed to the ground. The stone floors were cut clean.
In scenes eerily reminiscent of New York 55 years later, the Jerusalem bomb was the beginning of terrorism as a media event, designed to capture the world's attention.
The latest casualty list included 65 killed, 47 injured.
The perpetrators, Zionist Jews, members of Menachem Begin's Irgun terrorist network. Begin, who would one day become Prime Minister of Israel, described this tactic as turning Palestine into a glass house, where the entire world was looking in.
I think it was one of these acts of violence that, ahead of its time, I mean, in an era before CNN, before instantaneous news, was choreographed precisely to attract international attention.
We were a minority, but we were a minority with a clear ideology that we must have a Jewish state.
The bombing of the King David Hotel was perhaps one of the most significant terrorist incidents of the 20th century. For many decades, it actually held the infamous record of having killed the largest number of people.
In a fight for liberty, you have always those who are more, call them extreme, or more adamant, or call them staunch, and they want it immediately, not to wait for the Messiah.
The British military and administrative headquarters was here, in the south wing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. The luxury hotel itself still functioned with guests, restaurants, bars, and Sudanese waiters.
If we succeed,
It's very important the whole world will see that he can fight even the British.
Begin and Ellis decided on a daring plan. They would strike at the very heart of British rule, the King David Hotel itself. If they succeeded here, the whole world would take notice. The terrorist bomb was hidden in 7 milk churns and delivered in a hijacked pickup truck to the hotel's basement kitchen.
We jumped out and everyone took up their positions. I took the churn and started to run. I was thinking, how do I get to the place where I have to put the churn down? That's how I started. Anyway, there were lots of people around in the corridor, and we tried to move them out of the way. Here, there, to the side. But there were some who resisted, but we threatened them with our weapons. I wasn't dressed as a civilian or a soldier. I was dressed like an Arab, with a jalaba and a keffiyeh, with that ring on your head. You know, like, oh, what's he called? The leader of the Arabs. You know, Arafat. There were 7 churns, weighing 350 kilos in all. I ran until I reached the place where I had to put it down, with the churn on my shoulder. I carried on, until I got to the place where the British people were. I saw a pillar that used to be here, and I put the churn down and ran away immediately. I waited in my position until all the churns were together, and then the time would come for the explosion. All the churns together were like one whole man, a complete bomb.
The bomb went off at 12:37 and was devastating. But of the 91 dead, only 28 were British. 17 Jews died alongside 41 Arabs. Of all these, 54 were innocent civilians, unconnected to the British authorities in any way.
Once more, the civilized world has received a rude shock at the hands of fanatics whose wanton act is contrary to the dictates of all creeds alike and imperils the best interests of the cause that it strives to promote.
The Irgun denied that they aimed at civilian targets, but one man at least had a different opinion. In 1948, the British Chief Secretary in Palestine, Sir Henry Gurney, wrote in his diary of how one Irgun attack was indiscriminately aimed at civilian targets and was designed to create panic among the population. 3 years later, Gurney himself was to be assassinated. By 1948, the British and the world community had lost their appetite for the fight against the Jewish terrorists, and the British abandoned Palestine.
I was among the people that conquered Akko. When we were walking around, we entered a flat. There was a pair of shoes of a small child, maybe 2 years old. They didn't have time to put on the shoes, so they left the shoes and they ran away. They left everything.
We found out that there was a systematic expulsion of Palestinians, and there was, as I said, there was an ethnic cleansing operation taking place.
The most infamous campaign was the massacre at the village of Deir Yassin, where over 100 men, women, and children were systematically murdered.
هذا البيت كان متخبين فيه أنا وولادي وأخويا موسى. مكاليت أنا معيد أخوي موسى مشاكل نتونس في الله فيه. هذا البيت. أجوا قالوا لما كنا بالبيت كنا مش كسر خبطنا الكنبلة وجينا صوبت أنا وبنت الصواب تلمسح ولادي. وكان بعد ما راحت المراكة الحالة كانت تكسر الباب عليهم وطلعونا. بدهم يقتلوا أخوي مسادبة فيه على وجهه اللي يقتلوه. تناولت 250 ليرة من عدة. وكنت يا خواجة بس مشان الله الطالب بالدسات كنت لسه قال لي كتير انت كويس هات المصاري وبارس اخوتي الحنو شو نسوي فيها اخوتي الحنو اجراك يا ويلي هي زمتك على السلام راكي حبيبي وجدت اللي هو اللي حط لك الخمس زيت ويكون راسك موسى كدابة حط لك 5 مليون تحت راسها.
Villagers were expelled en masse and massacres occurred in many places.
Once Zionist troops occupied the village that resisted them, they would round up all the men according to lists the intelligence officers would provide. On the whim of the local commander, they would either shoot them or march them away. The biggest expulsion and massacre happened in the city of Lid Ramle. 50,000 people were expelled from the city in a single day. 426 men, women, and children were killed by the Zionist forces. The general in charge of the occupation and expulsion of Lid Ramle was Yitzhak Rabin, who would later become Israel Prime Minister, serving 2 terms.
Early June 1967. The 6-day war in the Middle East between Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria is underway. A spy ship, very lightly armed, but bristling with antennae, steams into the Mediterranean to eavesdrop on the conflict. It is patrolling in international waters off the Egyptian coast. At 2 in the afternoon, on June the 8th, with the war reaching its climax, Israeli jets and motor torpedo boats launch an unprovoked attack on the ship. They drop napalm and strafe its decks with rockets, cannon fire, and armor-piercing rounds before trying to sink it with torpedoes.
We had no way to defend ourselves, and it was just, we're just slaughtered.
And they shot up the life rafts that were put into the water, and they shot the ones that were still on board the ship.
Bullet holes, shell holes everywhere, blood. The forecastle, the front part of the ship, was just red with blood.
Throughout the attack, the ship flies the Stars and Stripes, the flag of Israel's closest ally, the United States of America. Its name, the USS Liberty, is freshly painted on its stern, and the bow carries the distinctive numbers of an American naval vessel.
Out of a crew of just under 300, there were 34 killed and 172 injured in varying degrees to life-threatening, life-debilitating injuries. So that was more than 2/3 of the crew.
By the time the Liberty arrived off the coast of Egypt on the 8th of June, the war had just 2 days left to run. Israel had seized the old city of Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Jordanian forces were beaten, and Egypt was conceding defeat. Only Syria held out.
The airwaves were dead. The only voices we did get were those of Israeli or Hebrew was what we were hearing. My name is Bob Wilson. I worked for NSA on June the 8th, 1967. What we were trying to monitor, find something coming from the direction of Egypt. There just was nothing. They owned the skies and the ground and everything. I don't think there was anything moving at that time that they didn't know about.
I was listening to the chatter the night before. They knew it was an American ship that came into the area. They knew who we were.
For the first time, this and other evidence allows us to reveal the true story of what happened that day and what came after. When a deadly assault by one ally on another was covered up, and an American president was manipulated by the secret agents of a foreign power, events that have shaped U.S.-Israeli relations ever since. They jammed radar sets at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, so the Americans couldn't detect their jets taking off to launch a surprise assault on Egypt. Meanwhile, the USS Liberty was sailing across the Mediterranean into the war zone.
Liberty was a state-of-the-art intelligence-gathering vessel of the time, and what we did is we listened. We were a listening ship. My name is Lloyd Painter. I was a research officer. We could receive any signal that was out there, low band, high band, anything, intercepting it, recording it, and we did have on board some translators who could have immediate translation of what was going on. We would actually bounce signals off the moon back to NSA.
5:15 a.m., first light. The ship's log recorded an Israeli photo reconnaissance plane flying over the Liberty.
It was easily identifiable as a NOR Atlas aircraft, and those are photo reconnaissance aircraft.
Israeli records obtained by Al Jazeera show that their reconnaissance plane reported the Liberty as an American spy ship, hull number GTR-5.
Well, I was on the bridge. I'm John Scott. I was the damage control officer. And it circled the ship kind of in a broad circle and headed back towards Israel.
Israeli planes then continued to fly over the Liberty all morning.
And they would do half-moon passes over us, and we saw that they were Israeli.
They were slowly lumbering over our ship, and we were waving at them, they were waving at us.
They were sophisticated, almost as sophisticated as we were as far as surveillance and technology. They had everything. We supplied them with all the technology to this day.
And I felt that we were in great shape because they knew who we were.
They're our friends. We felt safe. Actually, it was a secure feeling to see them.
There was one other thing which made the crew feel safe.
We had an American flag flying the standard, and then we put up the holiday colors, which is a huge American flag. And it was a bright sunny day with the wind blowing, I don't know, 5 or 10 knots. The flag was unfurled. You could see it for miles.
Meanwhile, Israeli military jets were on their way. On the real-time audio tape obtained by Al Jazeera, at 1:53 p.m., the pilots asked their base control about the ship. The USS Liberty was the only ship of any size in the area. The American Sixth Fleet, including 2 aircraft carriers, was 500 miles away.
Sun was shining, blue sky, clouds, nice, people sunbathing on the deck. We had lunch, and 5 minutes later, maybe, here came the jets, and nobody really knew what was happening until they started firing at us.
The captain said to me, alert the forward gun mounts, we're under attack. And I tried to raise the 2 sailors in the forward gun mounts. I looked out, and they were blown to pieces by the rocket.
When the attack started, and we realized that we needed help, we tried to communicate with the Sixth Fleet.
They were jamming both our distress frequencies and our tactical frequencies. The tactical frequencies is all right, but the international distress frequencies is a violation of international law to jam them, and the Israelis were jamming them.
And we could not get a signal across. Here's the question I have to ask. Who would know the frequencies other than an ally? And who was the ally in the war? It wasn't Egypt. It was Israel. They would know, and only they would know in this conflict, what our frequencies would be.
Now cut off from the outside world, the crew on the Liberty was defenseless.
We had 450 caliber machine guns on board that were basically there to repel any boarders that might come by, you know, a pirate situation. Certainly weren't designed to bring down jet aircraft that were hammering at us.
But you can't shoot a jet going 600 miles an hour with a 50 caliber machine gun. It doesn't work.
It was just a surreal scene. People who had been standing there earlier joking and laughing were now dead, dying, and with the walking dead and wounded. It was just unreal.
Gasoline barrels stored on the deck of the ship burst into flames. The crew rushed to try to put out the fires.
I was watching the aircraft as they circled around, and when they got to coming back towards the ship, I just holler at him down. They'd fire and circle back around. We'd jump back up and keep fighting fire. The rocket noise is horrendous. When a rocket explodes, you can't escape a rocket. I don't care where you go.
What the crew didn't know was that at 2:03, the Israeli pilots were ordered to use a new, much deadlier weapon.
The biggest problem, I guess, from that was the napalm, which they dropped from the airplane.
The napalm had burned, scorched almost the entire front part of the ship, the bridge area.
The whole top side of the ship had been set on fire, and it was all charred. It was no longer navy gray.
You have to stop the fires, to stop the flooding, to keep that ship afloat. That's your home. You got nowhere else to go. You can't pack up and go down the road, because there is no down the road.
Up above, the Israeli military argued about what should happen next and who should sink the Liberty.
I remember thinking, I was in pretty good shape then. I said, I think I can swim it to the shore. And then I thought sharks. And I thought a lot of things, all quickly, you know.
At 11 minutes past 2, with the Israeli jets running out of ammunition, the pilots were instructed to fly down and confirm the identity of the ship. The jets then pulled out, but 3 Israeli Navy motor torpedo boats were already on their way. At 2:35, the Israeli motorboats fired 5 torpedoes. 4 missed, but 1 hit. It had been over 9 hours since the Israeli military first identified the Liberty. Israeli planes had flown over it repeatedly, and 20 minutes earlier, their control tower had confirmed it yet again as an American ship. 25 Americans were about to die in a single moment. This is what it looks like when a torpedo hits a ship the size of the Liberty.
The torpedo threw us up in the air like a roller coaster. It felt like one coming down. Dead silence, lights all off, smoke and haze everywhere.
I went back to the drinking fountain and filled it with blood. Reached down to get a drink, and a black man stared back at me.
And when it fell back to get right, it just kept getting wrong. Kept sinking and sinking and sinking.
And my job was to try to get probably 20 or 30 wounded sailors out to the main deck and to the life rafts. So I went up and looked out myself before I tried to get anyone up. And that's when I observed a motor torpedo boat, Israeli, machine gunning our life rafts.
The crew of the Liberty were now trapped on board their own ship with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide.
The torpedo boats came in closer and began to machine gun the ship using armor-piercing projectiles.
The armor-piercing, the shells that they were using were leaving holes about that big around in the metal plating. Just peeled it out like it was orange peel.
One of the radiomen had taken a reel of coax cable and ran it from one of the transmitters back there to that whip antenna, and took some shrapnel in the process. He got out a mayday. Firefox, Firefox, this is Rock Star. Under attack by unidentified surface and naval air units, require immediate assistance.
The American Sixth Fleet was 500 miles away and picked up the signal. So did the Israeli armed forces. The attack stopped shortly afterwards. The American aircraft carriers were in the middle of a nuclear weapons drill and had to rearm with conventional bombs before they could take off. Once the Israelis knew the US jets were in the air, they summoned the American naval attaché and told him there had been a terrible mistake. The American planes were recalled.
Their plan was to take the Golan Heights starting on the 9th of June. This was the 8th of June. They couldn't communicate with their forces up there in Golan Heights without the Liberty intercepting the messages. And so, what do? Well, if you're pretty sure that the U.S. is going to have to let you off on this, you destroy the ship, you sink all the tapes as well, and you destroy all the survivors, so that You can go up on the Golan and not give the U.S. the opportunity to bang on you again, say, look, don't do it. In other words, in the Israeli frame of mind, it was better to ask for forgiveness rather than for permission. And that's precisely what they did. They went up on the Golan the next day. They didn't want us to know about it. They didn't want us to interfere with their plans. And that's one explanation. Now there's another. And this is sort of gory. There is Al-Arish, which is up about 1,000 prisoners. And prisoners are a real pain, you know, in Sinai. You have to feed them, you have to give them water, and it's a real pain. And so what happened here, according to Bamford and these eyewitnesses, is that Egyptian prisoners of war, there were about 300 or 400 of them in the coastal town of Al-Arish there in the Sinai, they were lined up, they dug their own graves, they were shot, and that's the way they took care of the Egyptian prisoners. Now, the Liberty is patrolling directly opposite Al-Arish, okay, in international waters, but with an easy range to pick up the intelligence on what's going on there, okay. Line of sight. I mean, you could see the Liberty big as it can be right off the shore. Now, the Israelis were well aware of that, and that wouldn't be terribly good PR to get back to the U.S.
Israeli helicopters flew out to the Liberty.
The U.S. Naval Attaché dropped a brown paper sack on the deck in the forepart of the ship, weighted down with an orange, had a business card in it. It landed right next to the severed leg of one of the deck personnel.
And the note said, "Do you have casualties?"
As soon as the news reached Washington, the attack on the Liberty instantly triggered a domestic political crisis. According to documents released under the Freedom of Information Act, one solution suggested in American government circles was to sink the Liberty so journalists could not photograph it and inflame public opinion against the Israelis.
We know that the establishment of Israel was just and necessary, rooted in centuries of struggle and decades of patient work. But 60 years later, we know that we cannot relent, we cannot yield, and as president, I will never compromise when it comes to Israel's security.
I want to thank you, Democrats and Republicans, for your common support for Israel, year after year, decade after decade. I know that no matter on which side of the aisle you sit, you stand with Israel. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all. You're wonderful. Thank you, America. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Honor here, but we have some of your reaction during the speech, and you look less than thrilled hearing the speech. And as we roll it back, let me tell you what the National Review said. Rand Paul's outspoken views against muscular foreign policy and foreign aid. You look less than enthused while the Prime Minister spoke. What were you thinking?
You know, I think what's funny about it is that you have these gossipy websites who really demean themselves by putting stuff like that out. I gave the Prime Minister 50 standing ovations. I co-sponsored bringing him here. And on the day that I also decided to co-sponsor the Corker bill that says any final deal has to be approved, we have gossipy websites looking up at, you know, the metric of how fast you clap. I mean, I think they demean themselves by putting that out.
Do you think that is Netanyahu right, that the president can't be trusted on getting a secure deal out of Iran?
Well, that's, you know, I'll get to the heart of this speech now. This man from a foreign government walked into the United States legislative chamber and tried to take over U.S. foreign policy. He said, you should trust me, not your president, on this. I am the man you should trust. I am your true leader on this question of U.S. geopolitics. To protect yourself, you must listen to me and not to this president. It was a startling situation. To allow someone to come in knowing that that was going to be their message in the chamber of the U.S. Congress. This was a decision made by and certainly complied with by Netanyahu and his ambassador Dermer. They went into the U.S. Congress to take over U.S. foreign policy today from the president. It's a remarkable day when the leaders of the opposition in Congress allowed this to happen. Think it through. What country in the world would let a foreign leader come in and attempt to wrest from the president control of U.S. foreign policy? And that's what the applause was about today. That was what the battle of applauses was about, to take power away from the president. So we'll see. It may succeed. We may see that there's going to be a lot more legislative intent here in terms of any treaty, a stronger push by Congress to insist on a vote up or down on any treaty. But clearly that was what was going on here.
When it comes
This was a takeover attempt by Netanyahu with his complying American partners to take American foreign policy out of the hands of the president.
Chris, as you say, it was stunning, especially when we get certain reaction. The Atlantic's Jeffrey Goldberg.
In fact, we'll start tonight in the Middle East, where Israel... What? Israel isn't supposed to defend itself?
Oh, yeah, if Mexico bombed Texas, will we exercise
What other country held to the same standard as Israel? People that want to destroy our terrorism? What is the matter with you? It's the only democracy in the Middle East, you turd!
Self-hating Jew?
That was weird. Anyway, what I was saying was last Thursday saw the start of a new ground offensive launched by Israel. Holy look, obviously there are many strong opinions on this issue, but just merely mentioning Israel or questioning in any way the effectiveness or humanity of Israel's policies is not the same thing as being pro-Hamas.
Can you read that? Can somebody read that for me?
United Nations Resolution 3013 from 1973 states, the struggles of peoples under colonial and alien domination and racist regimes for the implementation of their right to self-determination and independence is legitimate and in full accordance with the principles of international law.
Legitimate and in full accordance with the principle of international law. This describes the Palestinian struggle, because that is exactly what Israel is. Now, in this picture, I stand with my friend Jamal, who sat in Israeli prison for many, many years. In fact, he was given a life sentence, but he was exchanged in one of the prisoner exchanges between Israel and the PLO. And the reason he was given a life sentence is because he killed a soldier. He and 3 others, saw 2 young Israeli soldiers guarding a bank in Ramallah, of all things. And soldiers are usually fully armed, of course. And they approached them and they stabbed them to death with a knife. And for that, they were later on, beaten, tortured, and arrested and given life sentences. But when I see the picture of the 2 of us standing side by side, I have to wonder, which one of us is really the terrorist? Because according to this, it's certainly not him. I, on the other hand, served in the Israeli army, an army of occupation, an army of oppression, an army whose sole purpose is to make sure that he does not have a state, he does not have rights, and he dare not resist. So yes, my army has uniforms and commanders and generals, but which one of us is really the terrorist?
Alan Sobrowski is a writer and consultant specializing in national and international security affairs. In December 1988, he received the Superior Civilian Service Award after more than 5 years of service at the U.S. Army War College as Director of Studies, Strategic Studies Institute, and holder of the General of the Army Douglas MacArthur Chair of Research. A Marine Corps Vietnam veteran and a 1986 graduate of the U.S. Army War College, Dr. Sobrowski's teaching and research appointments have included the U.S. Military Academy and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. While in government service, he held concurrent adjunct professorships at Georgetown University and the Johns Hopkins University of Advanced International Studies. His published work includes 13 books or monographs and over 160 articles, chapters, and book reviews. So what happens when a military insider puts the devastating terror attacks of 9/11 directly at Israel's doorstep? Dr. Alan Sobrowski, thank you so much for joining us on The Autograph.
My pleasure, Susan.
Tell us how you make the case for Israel's involvement in the tragic 9/11 attacks.
There were several different ways of doing it, Susan, and this may be a little bit more background than some of your people need, but I began to have suspicions about what had happened on 9/11 about 2 weeks after the attacks. There were several discontinuities that made no sense to me whatsoever. The behavior on the part of some of the named terrorists, these 19 Arabs on 4 planes, running around flying schools like loose cannon, not having the pilot skills to fly the aircraft, no recognition for what they had done afterwards in their own area, their own community. And it struck me that for many reasons, none of the arguments that were being given for what they did made any sense. But I then immediately forgot about it until about 2 years ago. And then I came across a video which I found to be extremely disturbing. That video was an interview with a Dutch demolitions expert named Danny Jowenko. And it concerned the collapse of the 3rd World Trade Center tower to go down on September 11th. This was the 47-story World Trade Center 7, the 3rd tallest building at the World Trade Center. Jowenko had never heard of it. Neither had I. And when you looked at the building, you saw that there was effectively no damage to any face of the building. It had not been hit by a plane. It had not been taken major trauma from debris, and it went straight down into its own footprint in about 7 seconds in what was visibly a controlled demolition. You know, and it was pretty clear that whatever those 19 named Arabs on 4 planes, 2 of them at the World Trade Center, had or had not done, they could not have had any possible effect on that 3rd building going down. Shortly after that, I came across, partly out of my own curiosity, which this definitely aroused, and a very extensive video, both of which I've cited, by the way, in some of my recent articles, which were taken on 9/11 itself from what became Ground Zero, the base of World Trade Center 1 and 2, the Twin Towers, involving police, emergency services personnel, newspaper and television correspondents, and you can see and hear secondary explosions at the base of the World Trade Center buildings. Now, planes impacting at 800 to 1,000 feet above the ground are not going to cause secondary explosions at the ground floor. And this followed over into other reports, also there on September 11th,
about vans in the area, white vans. In one case, a van was picked up by police and people arrested at the access to a major bridge. The van was filled with explosives, and the 2 people in it were Israelis. In Bergen, New Jersey, same day, a van with several people in it had set up cameras. Before the first plane hit, they were filming the Twin Towers, and they were celebrating. High fives. It was a good thing for them. Residents called police. Police arrested them. All 5 were Israelis. What intrigued me, in addition to angering me, was that within days, all of these reports disappeared from the media. Most Americans don't know that a 3rd building went down at the World Trade Center. Most have never heard about the secondary explosions reported by CNN, ABC, Fox, and others at the foundation of World Trade Center 1 and 2. None have ever heard about the vans. So I began looking at this very carefully, and one of the things that I began looking at was just what would it have taken for a special operations group of any particular nationality to have done 9/11, either by having taken control of the operation we have been told about, of the 19 named Arabs on 4 planes, or having run a parallel operation where you have 4 planes being hijacked, but there is another operation being done with those in concert. And I picked up 3 particular factors that would need to be taken into account. One was motivation, a second was expertise, and the third, the critical one, was access. Now, when it came to motivation, it's probably a very sad commentary on where we are in the world today, that there are an awful lot of countries and groups out there in the world that have either real or contrived reasons to hate America. It wasn't that way when I was a young man, but then many things weren't the same way now as they were when I was a young man. But almost all of the groups and countries that might want to do this only had a negative reason for doing it. They wanted to hurt us. The Israelis had a positive reason, and it's one that a number of their supporters had talked about from the 1990s on up, and what was called the Project for a New American Century, whose members included, by the way, later Vice President Richard Cheney, later Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, and many of the so-called neoconservatives, most of them Jewish but not all, who came into the first Bush administration. Israel had a positive reason, and was get the United States involved in a war in the Middle East with a powerful, enraged, anti-Islamic strain within the American public.
He records his unit as it conducts raids trying to kill or capture insurgents. This house-to-house combat is not what America envisioned when the Iraq War began 2 years earlier. Elsewhere in the city, Marines take fire from insurgents hidden around a mosque. They respond by launching a Hellfire missile and a 500-pound laser-guided bomb into a perimeter wall. Arab news channel Al Jazeera broadcasts images of injured and dead, including women and children. The Marines now believe they're within days of securing the entire city of Fallujah. But the televised images inflame Iraqis.
Hey, watch your
Fire!
The next day, President Bush orders a ceasefire. After a bloody 3-week battle, the Marines pull out of Fallujah at the end of April. Foreign fighters now flood into the city. The perceived U.S. defeat strengthens al-Qaeda's control over the Sunni insurgency. Soon, another televised scandal does even more to strengthen al-Qaeda's power in Iraq. Media outlets release photographs of American soldiers abusing Iraqi detainees at Abu Ghraib prison.
The pictures of that abuse served as incredibly effective recruiting tools. Thousands and thousands of jihadis were created by that abuse.
I can't tell you how many guys we buried, American soldiers we buried because of that. That was the worst time for that to happen. You took a hornet's nest and you literally threw it on a bonfire.
That they needed a catalytic event to produce this. They even talked about it in terms of another Pearl Harbor is needed to bring the American people into this fight. The second was expertise. Lots of expertise out there. Bringing buildings down and controlled demolitions is something that almost any intelligence agency of any country in the world can do or can contract. There are many private agencies that do this. But one thing is absolutely clear. Neither those 19 named Arabs on the plane nor al-Qaeda as an organization had the expertise, the technical expertise to do that. The World Trade Center security was an Israeli-owned company. Security at all 3 of the airports from which the 4 aircraft on 9/11 departed, ICTS, was an Israeli security company. That security company, by the way, also had security at the airports in Paris and Amsterdam later, from which the so-called shoe and underwear bombers departed. The security company at the World Trade Center had 24/7 state-of-the-art electronic surveillance and foot patrols. Wiring a building for a controlled demolition, and I must confess here, this is not my specialty. I have heard what people who do this for a living have said about it, but it is not my specialty. But the description of it in the video of Danny Jawenko that I mentioned to you is a very good one on this. And he described it in which if you needed to do it in a few hours, you would need 30 to 40 people, fewer if you had more time, cutting open the walls, literally cutting open the walls, all the way around the building, implanting the explosives, running detonator cord and cable, wires to put them to a control system, coordinating all of this activity. This is not something that involves the casual bringing in of a briefcase and leaving it at the foot of a building's elevator and going out again. This is extensive work, and it would require the type of extensive sustained access that could not go unremarked by the security forces in place on this.
How about an elevator modernization, which we know was going on the 9 months prior to 9/11? Yes, Elevator World, March 2001 documents it. In fact, they were in the middle of this modernization. There are people who noted that the elevators were locked in turn and that there were guards placed at these locked elevators during the modernization. Of course, you would have to have access to security. Securicom was brought in. Who sits on the board of Securicom? Marvin Bush, the younger brother of George Bush.
Then a team of loading experts who would have access to all the core columns and beams. The rest could be accomplished at that point by just the right kind of explosives for the job at hand. The choices are many out there. You wouldn't need miles and miles of det cord. You could have used wireless remote detonators, and they have been available for years. You need to only look at an action movie to see them in use, and of course the military has them as well. In the case of thermite cutting charges, you would have heard far less noise, since they are worked by thermal heating, melting of the steel, rather than an explosive cutting as in RDX charges. Well, you wouldn't have found steel casings to be left in the rubble. They haven't been used for years. What we use now is RDX copper-jacketed shape charges, and when they're initiated, there's nothing left of those charges. And in the case of thermite, well, thermite self-consuming cutting charges have been around since they first patented in 1984. So there would be nothing left in the debris pile except some residue of molten iron.
They also needed the ability to evade an apprehension and to have their escape concealed. And they had that done. All of the Israelis who were apprehended in those vans were later released in about 2 months at the direction of Michael Chertoff, then the second director of Homeland Security, a dual U.S.-Israeli national. There is no mention of them in the mainstream media, which is largely Zionist-owned. All of the major networks, all of the major national newspapers, all 3 of the weekly news magazines, all of the major political journals, most of the major publishing houses. It simply didn't happen. The only thing that happened on 9/11 that was discussed in the media, that have been accepted by the government, that was described in the 9/11 Commission, are 19 named Arabs on 4 planes bringing down 2 buildings. And the rest of it, in Orwellian terms, has become a non-event and a non-story. All I would suggest to people is that you look at the films of WTC-7, that third tower going down on September 11th. You look and listen to the reports on September 11th with the secondary explosions. These are not fantasies. They happened. You look at the reports on September 12th of the apprehension of Israelis with vans of explosives and cameras filming the events on September 11. These are not fantasies. And you look at the people riddling the American government, all of the Middle East people in State Defense and the National Security Council, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Douglas Feith, who used to be a friend of mine, by the way, from Philadelphia. These people were all part of the neoconservative movement. Many of these people are dual U.S.-Israeli nationals. All of their primary allegiance is to Israel. And it is very clear that over a period of the last 40-odd years, that the penetration of the American political process, the effective subordination of the Congress in particular to Israel, when an Israeli prime minister can get 29 standing ovations from a Congress that can't give that much support to one of their own presidents, no matter how outlandish the statements, you have something as close to a puppet agency as you're going to find. Our policy in the Middle East has for decades been manipulated increasingly in terms of what benefits Israel and not what benefits the United States, even when that policy is articulated and supported by individuals who are sworn officials of the United States government. And to me, when a sworn official of the United States government, whether or not that person has dual Israeli citizenship, manipulates American policy, contrives crises and tragedies like 9/11, contrives wars like Afghanistan and Iraq, and now tries to get us into a war with Iran, all in the service of Israel, spending American lives in that process, they commit high treason, and they need to be treated in that manner. The thing that's intriguing about Zionism, and I think I use the phrase that it's a real witch's brew of xenophobia, ultranationalism, and militarism, with a nice scrap of regional imperialism built into it. Most nationalism is not like that. Most nationalism is intended to be a unifying force, but it doesn't go to such an extreme level. A second element of it is that when you have competing nationalisms, it's very, very rare to find anything that involves the level of antipathy and hatred to the other side.
Do you think the Lord would wish bad for others?
He doesn't wish bad for others. How many lands did he give the Arabs? How many Medina did he give the Arabs?
So that gives you the right to kill tens of thousands of other Arabs?
Yeah.
You have the right to kill tens of thousands of Arabs and take over their
homes. Killing them because they're...
I don't know what that means, but actually I don't want to know because you're...
Now get out of my land. Get out of my land. You get it?
I hope someday you will realize.
No.
Someday you will learn.
You get it?
Someday you will learn. Someday you are a child. Someday you will learn, and hopefully you will be at peace with yourself. Okay? I wish the best for you.
You get out of
I
my
wish
land.
the best for you.
Trying to break your camera? Listen, you.
Yeah?
Break it. I'll break it.
Okay, buddy.
It's okay.
Calm down.
Israel is occupying the Palestinian people in my name, in the name of world Jewry, and I myself, an American Jew, am here to say that that is completely unjustified and ethically reprehensible. And we will, world Jewry and all people of the world will not stop until this occupation ends and until the Palestinian people have their right of return, their right to live without occupation, and equal rights within Israel. That is why we are here. This is my passport. I will not give you my passport. I'm not giving you my passport. I have a right to be here. I have a right to be here. Don't push me. Do I need to call my... I'm going to call my consulate right now. Get off me. Do I need to call my consulate right now? Do I need to call my consulate right now? Do I need to call my consulate right now? Call the consulate. Call the consulate.
I think many Americans are finding it difficult to relate to their government, but the idea that there's any kind of a mass movement there because of the relationship to Israel is simply not the case. There is no vehicle for that type of opposition to have been created. There is not even an awareness on the part of most of the American people about the details of 9/11 that I mentioned to you. One of my last article was much more of a practical, how do we get the word out? And I think that if people did understand what had really happened at 9/11, you could very rapidly see a very substantial reorientation of public opinion.
Is there anything else that you want to say to anyone out there, anyone who might be wanting to come forward but they're scared?
I want to thank you because you're all we have. InfoWars, right? And independent press to try to get the word out to the public because the public is mesmerized by the mainstream media. And let me give you my opinion of the mainstream media. The mainstream media is, their mission is to act as the most effective weapon of mass deception and public manipulation the world has ever seen. And if you don't think that's so, ask anyone any taboo question that the mainstream media frowns upon with its army of trusted celebrity prostitutes.
Right.
All right?
We've seen
and you will see a sadly predictable knee-jerk reactionary response from the public, because that's what they've been trained to believe and trust in.
Right.
All right?
Absolutely. Well, we are very glad that you took the time to speak with us to try and help break through that paradigm. We see, you know, here it is, it's very much like they live all around us with all this programming and just consistent programming with the ceremony. And we're just so thankful that people like you aren't afraid to speak out, aren't afraid to be laughed at, aren't afraid to be, you know, your friends say, what are you doing, man? Come on, maybe disrespectful.
You know, I think times are telling, because, as you know, my name is Rudy Dent. I did an interview with Ludowski, yeah. And that interview got over 51,000 views and still climbing. Right. It got over 1,500 likes, yeah. And it only got 32 insults.
Right.
All right?
The people, that's not bad. They're ready for the truth. And they can think, you know, 13 years, people are going to forget. We will never forget. We remember. You remember
this. The founding fathers were up against impossible odds. They were up against King George III, upon whose holdings the sun never set. They were only 4%. And look what happened.
Absolutely. America.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Well, Leah McAdoo reporting from Times Square, and there you have it. The people are ready for truth. It does not matter how many of these anniversaries go by, the truth will reveal itself in due time.
This is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror. Consistently, along 6 or 10 years, Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea, this is the only way. Without this clarity of purpose, there will be no world order, no world order possible here.
If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region. And the reverberations of what happens with the collapse of Saddam's regime could very well create an implosion in a neighboring regime like Iran. In the Middle East, Iran now dominates 4 Arab capitals: Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a. The most dangerous of these regimes is Iran. If this regime or its despotic neighbor Iraq were to acquire nuclear weapons, this could presage catastrophic consequences. Only the United States can lead this vital international effort to stop the nuclearization of terrorist states. Time is running out. We have to act.